When civilians need help, they call the police. When the police need help, they call the Emergency Service Unit.
Police emergency service workers are being credited with saving a woman's life.
New York cops in full combat regalia.
CNN, there are reports of an explosion possibly.
It's a goosebump-inducing intro, and it's very, very well done. Anytime I get a boss from ESU on, whether it was a sergeant, a captain, or a lieutenant as well, of course, I bust out that introduction because we do have a boss tonight. I'll get to him in a little bit, but welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 254 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. We're staying within the SOD of NYPD, if you will, because the previous episode was with Oscar Smith, who retired as a detective out of the Air Sea Rescue Unit. That was the first time I had ever interviewed an NYPD diver, so that was fun. And he responded to the Miracle on the Hudson in 2009 too, so we talked a little bit about that. And he's running his own gym now. He started it in 2003, OD Studio. 20 years later, still going strong in the heart of Manhattan. So tonight should be great. I read about my next guest, who I'll introduce in a little bit, when I was doing some homework for a previous show on the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He had a big role in helping rescue some trapped and terrified civilians there, but he did a lot more than that across a 20-year career in the NYPD. But first, we got to take care of business. It's sponsor time. The first one, well, it's me. It's my consulting company.
Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company.
It's weird to be 23 and running your own business. And I have a good secretary, of course, that secretary being my mother, because if your mother's a paralegal, why not use her? So that's my consulting company, of course. And now for an actual sponsor, retired NYPD police officer turned attorney, Joe Murray.
If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com.
Appreciate Joe as always, a great guy, and thanks, Joe, for always taking care of me and looking out for me. So with that being said, and one last thing, of course, super chat, super thanks. If you want to throw some money in there tonight, I'll appreciate it for sure. So now my next guest, for the majority of the 20 years in which he served in the New York City Police Department, was a rescue cop as a member of the Emergency Service Unit. 2 stints in ESU, so he understands both sides of the coin. He was a police officer in the unit from 1985 until 1989, and he was a boss, like I said, in the Emergency Service Unit as well, because he returned a couple of years later as a sergeant after a stint in Brooklyn, which he'll tell me about tonight. And then he spent 1991 until 2001 in ESU as a sergeant working across the city. So meaning to get him on the show for a long time, and that for this volume 32 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit is retired NYPD Emergency Service Unit Sergeant Tim Farrell. Sergeant Farrell, welcome. How are you?
Good evening. Thank you, Mike. Very well. You?
I'm doing all right. Like I said, long time coming. Had to rep ESU tonight. I got this shirt down at Floyd Bennett Field, so I'm rocking it. Hope it comes through in the light it does there. So special thanks down to the guys at Floyd Bennett that hooked me up with this a little while ago when I was down there for REMA Day. And special thanks to all you in the chat tuning in tonight. And we got John Latanzio here and Steve Stefanakis. There's my friend Tim. He's already here.
Hello, Steve.
Good to see you, Steve. Good to see you, John, and everybody else tuning in tonight. Like I said, if you got a question, super chat's there, fire it away. I'll make sure I get to it at the appropriate time. Before I get to your police career, where'd you grow up, and did you have family on the job?
No, actually, the first one in my family to come here. I I was born in New Jersey, and my father worked for the Ford Motor Company. The plant closed down, and we moved to Williston Park, and that's where I currently live. I actually bought my parents' house. I've been living in the house for over 50 years. A wonderful place to grow up. It was a wonderful place for me to also raise my children. I raised 4 boys here. They're all, successful out in the world today, working, have their own insurance, have a retirement plan. We're all good.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. The offspring's doing all right. Carl Smith says a good man, Tim Farrell. He's tuning in tonight. And Ray Ruiz is here too. And he says, Hey, Mike, congratulations. Hello, Tim. Great boss. True gentleman. Good to see all you guys as well. Appreciate you guys tuning in, like I said. So Paul Mannix was on recently for my FDNY miniseries. His sister Delia, of course, was in ESU as a lieutenant. And he was mentioning, because he began his career before he rolled over as a New York City cop, that it was Irish welfare, if you will. Take all the tests, try to get on, whichever department you can, PD, FD. Back then, you had 3 different police departments to choose from. Was that your case? Take all the tests and see what happens?
No, Mike, I'll tell you, it's pretty funny. I was young guy in Williston Park. Went to school to become an architect. I went to NYIT. Really interested in architecture at the time, and I was working part-time for a tennis club. And a local friend, actually grew up on the block here with me. Said that, one, he got me involved in the volunteer fire company. I joined Williston Park Fire Department in 1977, became a volunteer firefighter, and then my friend Tim Joyce opened me up to the civil service exams. So I took FDNY, NYPD, Nassau County, a few of them. And I was in my college program, and my artistic ability wasn't what I was in competition with. And I felt that if I stayed with it, maybe I'd end up being a draftsman rather than an architect. And so when NYPD offered me the job, I took the job. I was 20 years old when I got into the academy, so relatively young. Left college, went off to become a New York City police officer.
And I smirk because, of course, anytime Steve's in the chat when I'm interviewing a former E-man or E-woman, he's throwing in some zingers, and he says, Tim Farrell is definitely not Irish welfare. He's lace curtain Irish.
Thanks, Steve.
Good to see you, Steve. Thanks for tuning in as always, like I said earlier. So getting on during that time, as we were talking about off the air before we came on, neighborhood stabilization units, which went away in the 90s, they're still in existence here. And hey, Andy Burchett, he's tuning in tonight. Just saw him pop up in the live chat. So your first NSU was NSU 18, which is in Queens, and it's covering multiple precincts. Let's go through them real quick. 102, 103, 105, 106, and the 113. So a lot of territory for a rookie cop to learn from. Who was teaching you? And tell me about that learning curve during a time when, even if that particular area is not hard hit for the sake of argument, the city is rocking as a whole with crime.
You know what? There were a really great crew of people that were training us. Obviously, we had a sergeant in charge, and then a number of detectives that would take us out on patrol. And what was so good, Mike, is that these people were dedicated. I think, like myself, and most of the cops that I know joined because they actually wanted to help people. It wasn't Irish welfare or other, a civil service job and a retirement. Certainly, those are some benefits, but I'm in a private sector now, and there's so much more money to be made in the private sector, and there's different career opportunities out here. It's just amazing. So a few of those detectives were just outstanding in supporting me. Also, I will say that I had quite a number of police officers that I learned together with, and it just made for a great experience. Interestingly, I'll tell you one story about the NSU that really comes to mind. I was, on NSU when we were now assigned on our own in a car, and I was assigned with a woman. Her name was Loretta Kennedy. Loretta ended up becoming a high-ranking officer in NYPD and eventually left, and I think she went to work for JetBlue eventually. But Loretta and I were on patrol, and this is when I realized how important a woman's perspective can be. We went to a number of jobs, and her calm demeanor, her way to de-escalate things was a great learning experience for me. But on the other hand, we did a car stop one day, and we had 4 bad guys in a car with guns. There were, I think, 13 guns we took out of the car. And Loretta got out of the car. I got out of the car. We approached it the right way. We had our guns drawn. And she started saying that she was going to kill somebody because they were moving around too much and they were not doing what we were asking her. And eventually we took them all out of the car. We put them all in handcuffs. It said to me right there that, yes, women can do this job. And I had a lot to learn from her. So there were a lot of people that certainly I learned from in NSU.
Oh, without question. And many a cop across the country, across the world, unfortunately, has been killed, if not seriously injured, in scenarios like that car stop. When you were telling that story, I thought of Kevin Gillespie in 1996. He didn't even have time to draw his gun. All he did was get out of the car, unfortunately, and he was shot. So you can never take those things too lightly.
No.
Not at all. Not at all. So from the NSU, your first permanent command was the 109, 82 to 85. So it's 3 years there. And now you're kind of you have your feet under you a little bit from the experience in NSU. Now it's good to be in a permanent command. You're on a foot post, I imagine, first before you get into a sector car. But being in the 109, having been in an NSU previously that covered that area, did it make that transition into the first command a little bit easier?
It did. The 109 was an interesting precinct, too. It was very large geographically, large square miles. I think it's 13 square miles. So in New York City, it was a really big precinct. The other thing is there was a good mix. There was some, suburban areas with middle-class families all looking to, live a good life. And then there was some very difficult areas where they really needed the police. Actually, I made a couple of really big arrests early on. I made a burglary arrest that closed out like over 100 burglaries. They actually wanted to promote me right away, but I was only in the precinct a year. And so instead they gave me a detail in a robbery car, a plainclothes robbery car, eventually then moving on to anti-crime. But it was a great learning experience too. There were a lot of older cops at the time. In 1981, when I got in the police department, they had just started to rehire people after years. And so there are a lot of older police officers and many that were out there doing a great job, still running around to jobs and really willing to give us, some good lessons so that we could learn to be good cops and be safe as we did our job.
Absolutely. And like I said, during that time, it was a very chaotic time in the city. And you mentioned anti-crime. Now, this was anti-crime. Now it's a little bit different to not get into the bureaucratic aspects of it. It's neighborhood safety. But back then, this was the real deal. And I know Billy Ryan in the chat appreciates that. Before he went to arson and explosion, he was in street crime for a number of years himself. So being plainclothes in the 80s, I feel like it was a lot easier because there's not technology. People can still spot cops if they know the neighborhood well enough. But back then, there was no cell phone. So you could blend in a little bit better, even if you're someone that's not from the area. So getting in there as a plainclothes cop, tell me about that balance between thinking like a cop, but also trying to make sure you're an effective decoy to where you're not giving yourself away so easily.
So I had some great people teaching me there. One of my first partners, actually, I got into anti-crime with my original police partner. So we were both relatively young rookies, Dennis Verana. But we got into the robbery car. Then we both went to anti-crime. And I worked with a guy there. His name was Tom Sullivan. Tom was just an outstanding cop. I often would tell my wife, I'm not really a police officer. What do I know? Tom could just smell a criminal. We'd be driving around and he'd be telling me, okay, we got to turn the car around. Did you see that? And I'd be like, see what? Now, certainly I took the lessons and after a while I became more observant. But that was a way that we were able to learn. He could see a bulge on someone. He could see someone that wasn't acting right in a neighborhood, someone that was really looking at houses or looking at a business. And lo and behold, we'd follow when we'd get a robbery or burglary, all because of, some sixth sense that some of these people obviously may have learned or also had. Tom also was a New York City resident. I grew up in Long Island, and it was a little bit different growing up, certainly. And I had to get acclimated to the city way of life and how the city operated. And so I was, again, very fortunate to have a few of these mentors that allowed me to learn from them and really advance my career and work hard in the anti-crime unit. It was interesting because I wanted to go to emergency service. And when I finally got called to go, one of the squad people, asked me in the detective squad, what are you doing? You're on your way to getting a shield. You'll come up to the squad shortly. I said, well, that's really not what I'm interested in. I want to go to ESU.
We're talking with retired NYPD Emergency Service Unit Tim Farrell. This is Emergency Service Unit Sergeant, I should say. Tim Farrell. This is volume 32 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Just want to take a second to shout out all our friends in the live chat. There are some I mentioned earlier. The Truth, Billy Ryan, of course, who I mentioned, Jeremy Davila, Brian Keller, my buddy Kevin Ramirez is here under the name Pylon Blue. Of course, Steve, Carl, I mentioned you guys, Andy Burstad, Ray Ruiz, John Latanzio, Jay Driscoll's here, Raquel Pranzo, Pete Pranzo, retired NYPD lieutenant and author. And I love this comment. Patrick Roach via LinkedIn. Tim Farrell, great guy, mentor for me when I was younger with the volunteer fire department. I then did 28 years in the NYPD.
Hello, Pat. Good to see you.
Thank you, Pat, for tuning in. I appreciate that. Small world indeed. Good to see you because I think we're connected on LinkedIn. So very nice to see you here. So was it the volunteer? I mean, sometimes we see it in the volunteer fire departments on Long Island that a lot of the guys that are in there are either firemen in the city or emergency service cops in the city. Was there someone that was in the department that was in ESU that first kindled your interest in the unit?
Actually, Mike, it was, a good place for me, the volunteer fire department. I learned so much there. I really got a great education, and it's all free education, but it was serving the community. It was something that I really wanted to do. My father was a volunteer firefighter, not here in Wilson Park, but back in our hometown in Jersey. And so I guess it was in the blood already, and, something that I had an affinity to do. But I had a good friend on the block. His name was Tom Conley. His father, Pete Conley, was an emergency service police officer, and he was really an old-time emergency service police officer. A lot of times they would take people into emergency service that came from the task force. And if you know the old task force, typically you had to be a bigger cop to be in the task force. And TPF, so then they took those bigger cops into emergency. Pete Conley had great stories, a great man, a good mentor to me. At that point, my father had already had passed away. And so Pete watched after me, would take me in. I actually visited one truck once with Pete. And that's when I really, I didn't really understand how to be a cop. But I told you later on in my life, I had connected with a person that said, how you become a cop is you take a test. And that's when I started to get the feeling that what I wanted to do was be a police officer and get into this emergency service unit.
So just to make sure, because it could be a different Tom Connolly. Would this be the Tom Connolly that was in the bomb squad for a long time or a different guy?
No, that's funny. But I worked with Tom Connolly when he was in emergency service. That's another Tom Connolly.
Okay. All right.
And so my friend Tom was in NYPD, worked in the 20th precinct, but he left the police department to go to a fire department in Fairfax, Virginia. Became a chief down there. He just recently retired from the fire service.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Because when you said Tom Connolly, I was like,
Yeah.
I was like, there's a name I know, but small world, of course, similar name but different person. But both did great things. Both had great careers in their own right. Getting to
Pete Conley, his nickname was Knuckles, and if you know emergency service, everybody has nicknames. And I could only imagine why they called him Knuckles. He was the guy you wanted there when there was somebody going to give you a hard time.
I can imagine. You need a guy like that. So getting in 85, I remember when I first interviewed John Lampkin for volume 1 of this miniseries, which was a couple of years ago now. And he was telling me back then, now it's 6 months. I think back then it was 6 weeks that they would train you. So when you're getting in 85, I mean, just because it's 6 weeks doesn't mean it's any easier. You're cramming this information in and trying to teach a guy or gal in a very short amount of time. Now they become successful as you did, but it's a lot to absorb. So during that process, if it was 6 weeks, tell me about just trying to make sure you're attentive enough and alert enough to pick these things up so that way you can make it into the unit, because there's a lot of pressure. Even if you're happy with where you are, you want to get into the unit and not go back to the precinct.
Hey, Mike, like you may already know, and it's funny you keep mentioning all these names. John Lampkin and I were in emergency together. Obviously, we got promoted together. We both went to the 7-5 precinct as sergeants together. John, great friend, glad to hear his name too. But I will say, I believe it was 6 weeks or 7 weeks. But as much as it was shorter back then, everything that we added on to an emergency service, we would train everybody on. So guys would come back for in-service training. If there was a certification that we were trying to attain, we would give those certifying classes. And so guys would come back for that training. And so as much as it's a lot more time today, the person that continued to work in emergency service continued to get more of that training. Now, the other thing, Mike, that I'm sure you're aware of, emergency tries to take people with unique experiences, right? Something to offer NYPD. And you said it, there's a lot of volunteer firefighters that come into NYPD and they get some good training, right? Vehicle extrication, firefighting techniques, rescue techniques. I went through paramedic school, so I came into ESU as a paramedic. And so there are these skills that a lot of people come in with. I know that we had a couple of people that had come out of the Army. They had some, special training in the Army, and that allows people to come in and share those skills and knowledge with everyone else. And so, yeah, I'm going to say that 6 week, it was a lot of fun, first of all. Second, we really learned. We had some great people. Sergeant Riley was was the sergeant in charge of training when I went through STS. Korean War veteran and true blue emergency service boss. Just outstanding in trying to share all of his experience and knowledge, get it out to us so that we can get out there and help that police officer. As you know, that's the motto, right? NYPD, when you need help, you call NYPD 911. When a cop needs help, they're calling for us. And he instilled that's what we were going to do. And no matter what we were asked to do, we could get the job done. Great boss, great inspiration. I will say I had another person that gave me a lot of inspiration. He came into my volunteer fire company, moved to the neighborhood. He actually married a local girl from Williston Park. His name is Jim Carroll. Jim Carroll, great guy, probably a person who mentored me the most. Interestingly, when I got into emergency service, like I did when I finally retired, you collect these tools, elevator keys and lock picks and all these specialty items that could cost a little bit of money as you're moving along. But when Jimmy left ESU, he gave me his little toolbox, and when I left, I gave it to another younger member of ESU. So some of these things are handed down, but I'm going to say Jim Carroll was a great mentor, a great person, just a lifelong friend. Fortunate that NYPD had a man like that working for him. He eventually retired, went to a DA's office out here in Nassau County. I know Jim recently passed away, but just a great man.
And that you love people like that in neither department, because I have a few FDNY friends tuning in tonight. Garrett Lindgren, I see in the chat, he was in Rescue 3. That, again, during that era, they were coming out of Vietnam. They were coming out, some were even Korean War veterans, like you mentioned. So they're taking that experience from the Army and their combat experiences, too, on top of that, and instilling it in you. Because it's one thing to have a veteran in either department, but as a young fireman or as a young police officer, you're so blessed when these guys want to share that, because that means they still care enough about the job and they care about you and want you to be your best version to impart this wisdom on you. And I could tell just by the way that you were expressing yourself to this day, that still means a lot to you. That's wonderful to see.
Yeah, and I would say most every cop that I've met are like that. Our hearts are in the job. We want to help people. That really is the key to becoming a police officer or a firefighter, right? You're not joining it for the money. You're not joining it for the retirement in most cases. And you see it by people that stay on the job so long. They're in it because they love the job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we joke around, but look at Steve. Like, for example, Steve's been in the unit since when Housing Rescue came over.
6, what?
I set you up for that one perfectly. 1994, so close enough, so that's 29 years actually now. It'll be 30 years next year that he's been in ESU. And let me tell you something, you're going to have to carry that guy out of 10 truck. He's not going to want to go,
Well, he wouldn't make it in the private sector anyway, so.
We love you, Steve, of course, we kid. But man, there's a guy who's dedicated. There's a guy who's dead. And I was so disgusted because Owen McCaffrey, when we were down at REMA Day, asked Steve, when's your last day? He says, April 10th, 1930. And I thought about it. I'm like, I'm going to be 30 years old when this guy's going to retire. Gross. My goodness, he's going to be in that unit. He's been in the unit longer than I've been alive. But nevertheless.
And a great cop. I was fortunate to work in the same 10 truck with Steve.
Yeah, good man, great E-man, like I said, better man as well. So like I said, Steve, we love you, we kid. Tommy Ridges, speaking of great men, great to see Sergeant Farrell. He says, great E-man and even better man.
Hey, thanks, Tom.
Tom's doing great for himself as a lawyer currently. And come on the show, Tom. I've been trying to get you on for a while. Come on the show. I did send you a career timeline, so let's make that happen. So, this is the good men, mad city decade, if you will, because like I said earlier, when we were talking about coming out to the job, a lot's going on with crime. And I think the 80s is the most dangerous decade, or at least one of the most dangerous decades in the history of the NYPD. When, again, as I mentioned before, go on the Officer Down Memorial page and you see all the faces across transit, NYPD, and housing that were killed in line of duty in such violent ways: vehicular assault, gunfire. Emergency wasn't spared either. Joe, a couple of years after you came to the unit, Joe McCormack,
Yeah.
previously in '83, before you got there, was shot and killed in a standoff. So getting into ESU at that time, you're that last line of defense. And you mentioned some of the guys that would teach you. You were in 9 truck, which I think is pretty interesting because a lot of the ESU guys I get on, not too many of them come from that area. When you think of Queens, or at least when I do, I think of 10, but 9's there too. And you're covering the beach, I believe, down in the Rockies.
Yeah. Actually, 9 truck, when I first got into emergency service, was stationed in the 7-5 precinct, East New York, Brooklyn. And that's because they had some shifting around and some closing of trucks, before I arrived. And so 9 truck turned out of, like I said, 75th precinct. So we covered the 75th precinct along with all of South Queens, even down to the beaches. And, you're right, Mike. It gave us a tremendous amount of experience. We had some of the most deadly highways. The Interborough Parkway, now called the Jackie Robinson, was a death trap. It was horrendous. And we had more pin jobs on that roadway. And then the Belt Parkway and the Van Wyck Expressway, you couldn't get killed on a Van Wyck because you can't move anywhere on the Van Wyck. But, and then, being in the 7-5, one of the busiest precincts in New York through the 80s, and I realized it more when I became a sergeant, went back to the 7-5 precinct, just the killing fields. It was a horrendous place, to be a police officer. But thank God there were police officers that were dedicated trying to help the people that lived there. But then the rest of South Queens, having the ocean, we were there during floods and using equipment that we were trained on, these jet skis during floods and inflatable rafts, so that we can get out and rescue people that were flooded in their homes. The nor'easters that came in, the winter storms. I mean, it was just a tremendous amount of experience because of the different things that could affect the people that lived in those areas.
We got Evan Slattery tuning in as well in the chat. He says, "Hello, Mr. Farrell." And he says, "It's my first time catching a live stream, and it's you." So thank you, Evan, for tuning in.
Hey,
and you
Evan.
bring up an interesting point because, as Ronnie Griffith once told me, each truck represents an entirely different set of emergencies. Now, you're going to get your MBAs, you're going to get your tactical jobs, barricaded perp, things like that. Of course, that's common. But as far as those little intricate emergencies, they're unique to that truck. The storm areas, they're going to get hit hardest. The winter storms, like you said, the flooding, that's something that's unique to 9 and 10 because of where they are. You go down to 5 in Staten Island, it's a lot of animal jobs, deers, things that you wouldn't expect in other boroughs. You might get more tactical jobs in Brooklyn, but that's what I love about each ESU truck. It's an interesting area in and of itself. And by sending guys and gals to fly around in different trucks, they become more well versed in that, and they're able to do more, experience more, and understand more about the people that they're trying to help, and sometimes even the animals too.
Yeah, and that was a great part about the unit. And Mike, you obviously know this already, but for some other viewers, emergency service has 10 units throughout the city, and when a unit is short on personnel and there are extra people in another truck, a police officer will go to that other truck to work. So there were a lot of times we got to work with each other. And Mike, I'm going to say that was another great thing. As I said earlier on, people came into emergency service with a ton of different experiences. And so when you got to work with someone else, sometimes it was another training day for you. You got to a place where you learned some tremendous things from these people that are out there. I think of an old cop, John Fitzpatrick from 9 truck. John Fitzpatrick actually had a brother on the job, the fire department city of New York. His brother was killed off a rope rescue in the city. And John became an expert in rope work. And I worked with John in 9 truck. There was a guy that really was dedicated to making sure that we knew what we were doing with ropes. Just a great experience because of the people that were in this unit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't realize that he was brothers with that fireman. No, I think it was in the Bronx. He was trying to lower himself to help another fireman, and the rope snapped.
Yeah.
Garrett Linger in the chat, you would know more about that job than I would. But I mean, I do remember hearing about that job. I never knew that his brother was an emergency service cop. And real quick, I don't know how well you knew him, but I don't want to let this pass without mentioning him. While you were in the unit the first time, before your second stint as a sergeant, ESU, would lose another warrior, Frank LaSala, when he died in the fire in Manhattan at 1 truck in 1987. I remember Billy Kennedy telling me that story about that day. You were in the unit a couple of years. I don't know if you got to work with him at all, but if you have any memories of Frank, please share them.
I did work with Frank on one or two occasions. It wasn't a lot. Frank was, in one truck, obviously, and I was out in Brooklyn at the time. Funny, a lot of people from one truck didn't come into Brooklyn, but we did fly on occasion, and we'd all like to get to one truck, obviously, to see what that was all about. And he was a gentleman. I didn't work directly with him. I was working on the same tour with when Frank was working. But I will say it got me involved with the Washington, D.C. Police Memorial. Many of us obviously were devastated when Frank passed away, and certainly heroic actions that Frank tried to take. But after that, I learned more about the police memorial services. And so annually, there were a group of us that were going down to Washington, D.C. to honor these police officers, that have been killed in the line of duty. And that gave me another great experience. We did some volunteering with the families down there. And so we were working very closely with families of lost police officers. And it again was a good experience for us to understand why our heart is in this game and why you should continue to try to be well-trained and dedicated to paying attention every minute that you're out there as a police officer because of the danger that you're facing every day.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. Darren DeFries has a question here. It says, so each ESU truck is basically set up the same, but have some different items pertaining to a specific borough or precinct?
Yeah. Every big truck and every small patrol vehicle are set up almost identical. But then there is some special equipment in some different trucks. Some will have bomb containment vessels so that they can go and support the bomb squad, putting a bomb in the vessel to take it to the yard in order to take apart the bomb. Some have robots. Some have what we call cat cars that they can do escorts. So there was some specialty equipment in trucks that were strategically located throughout the city. But the large truck normally was manned by a chauffeur and a sergeant, and then the smaller trucks were out on patrol. The big truck would typically stay in quarters until it needed that support was needed. It had more equipment on it, and so when the smaller trucks were out on patrol and they needed extra equipment, the big truck would go out. Or it was a job that needed a boss, the big truck would go out. The great thing is, if there weren't enough sergeants at the time, there was a police officer that was normally a senior police officer in the truck that was then the police officer in charge, and he would sit in the in charge position, and he would be the one that would come out and give us advice on how to handle a job. And I can't tell you, they were some of the best cops or bosses, even though they may not have been bosses. They were just outstanding in getting us to work together. It's all a team when it comes to emergency service.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And regarding the job that was talked about earlier where those two firemen were killed, Garrett Lindgren says Larry Fitzpatrick, Rescue 3, was rescuing a firefighter from Ladder 28 who was trapped in a burning apartment. And that firefighter was John Frisbee of Ladder 28. So thank you to him and QC Beast in the live chat for adding further details to a very tragic job. Appreciate that, guys. So, there's a couple notable jobs in the 80s before I get to you getting promoted in 1989, where I remember Jack Cambria talking about a job where it was a standoff. A man was holding his two kids hostage and numerous cops were shot. Thankfully, not critically injured, but were shot nevertheless by this maniac. Of course, there was the Frank LaSalle job. There's a few collapses. A lot's going on, either in 9 truck or citywide. Is there an emergency from that time period that you were directly involved in that stands out?
There were so many. I remember we had an individual down in the Rockaways, and you think the Rockaways are a more quiet place, slower precinct, but there was an individual that the fire marshals were going after because he had been lighting fires. And so we get called and we're trying to negotiate with the individual. He's in his apartment. You could literally smell the gasoline. So we knew that he had flammables in his 3rd floor apartment. And we're trying to negotiate the whole time. In the meantime, we're a little bit concerned because, we have a firebomber that has materials that could potentially start a fire. And eventually the negotiations weren't working. I think he had his mother in an apartment. We were able to talk the mother out, but he wasn't going to come out. And we were concerned because he had a 30 caliber rifle. Actually, when the fire marshals went to the door, he had a 30 caliber rifle in his possession. And he chased the fire marshals out. And so we knew he had a rifle, and we knew that he had these flammable liquids. And so when negotiations failed, there was a team that was set up on the door. I was on the door team, myself and a couple of other officers and a sergeant. And we actually had Scott packs on, the heavy ballistic vest. We had a shield in front of us. We had a ram to get through the door. We obviously had weapons, and were concerned about facing a guy that can have a firearm and a firebomb. As soon as we breached the door, he did throw a Molotov cocktail at a pan of gasoline that was behind the door. It went up in flames. Again, we were pretty well protected because of the first guy with the shield. Most people started to back up. My fire training had me go right down to the ground. Fire went above my head. I could see the guy coming towards the door with the rifle. And, with the fire between us, I wasn't overly concerned that he could get through the fire, but I was a little concerned. We actually had a rope wrap on the handle of the door. So I was able to grab that rope, pull the door closed, and I was standing at the door ready that, he was going to fire through the door or through the wall, and I would try to fire back. Luckily, he didn't fire back at us. He actually went to the window and decided that the fire was too much, and he tried to go out the window on curtains that he had tied together. He fell. He fell probably a story and a half, but when he fell, he got up, and he got up with the rifle in his hand. And another emergency service officer was confronted with him, and they exchanged gunfire, and he eventually succumbed to his injuries.
Wow. I am so glad I asked that question. That was an incredible story. Incredible story.
Mike, there are so many, and I'm going to say, you could talk to any emergency police officer that's got time in the unit, and it's a matter of timing, right? We all volunteer to do this job, and it's amazing. We all got very good training. A lot of us want to be there for the big job, right? But it's happenstance. Are you working that day? Is that job something that you're called to? What do I have to do to get through this day and help people and go home?
Of course, and that's the main mission. Go home at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And emergency service, like I said earlier, is the last line of defense to ensure that. And if you guys can't ensure it, then nobody can. And it's interesting you bring up the fire marshals, because you're helping them out too. For those of you that may not be familiar, they are essentially what I call fire cops. And I say that lovingly. I love their operation. I love what they do. And I've had fire marshals as guests on the show previously for my FDNY miniseries. For those of you that are not from New York City or don't understand how it works, they're considered to be essentially police officers. They carry guns. They can make arrests. If, for example, if you're robbing someone and they happen to see you, they have just as much of a right to arrest you as a New York City cop would. And they're on the NYPD radio system. So if they call for a 1013, you guys in emergency would hear it. So you'd be able to assist them if need be, which as you did in that occasion, and thank goodness you did.
Yeah.
So that moves us to 1989. You get promoted to sergeant. By this point, unique spot in your career, 4 years in emergency service, 8 years in the job, so half that time in emergency. I imagine it's bittersweet. On one hand, yes, you're a sergeant now. You got promoted. You earned that great job. But on the other hand, you're leaving a great unit temporarily, but you're leaving. So tell me about the mixture of emotions I'm sure you were feeling back then.
Yeah, it was a little more than temporary, and it was just, again, timing, Mike. The job is a funny thing. How many bosses do they have in emergency service? How many openings do they have? But I really felt like it was meant for me to get promoted and try to help in a different way. It was a great experience for me. I got promoted. I went to the 83rd precinct. I'm going to say it was a drug-infested area in Brooklyn. The crime was, disaster. There was a famous incident. Maria Hernandez was a woman who lived in a house with her husband. Her husband was upset with all the crime that was going on in the neighborhood. And so he started to really work with the police to try to get the drug issues handled. And so one day the drug dealers drove by his house, tried to kill him, shoot through the window, and they killed his wife. It was a travesty. Yeah. But again, I got to work with some great cops there. And I will say, it's interesting, this is where I felt being a boss and having a cool head is something that you need to have to prevail. We obviously had some riots that were then going on. One night, a sergeant was in a crowd trying to quell the rioting people. He actually had his gun belt taken off him, his gun and everything. And it was a neighbor from a window that called to say that she's seeing this cop being assaulted and he needs help. And so we got backups in there. We got him out of there. I was on the 4 to 12 the next day, and the cops are like, we're just going to go and kick ass. We're just going to, get our batons, hats and bats, and we're not asking any questions. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I want you to understand that there are good people out there, that this sergeant had a neighbor call because his radio and his gun belt were taken. He had no way to communicate. And so there are good people here, and that's who we're working for. So we're going out and we're looking for the bad guys. We're not just doing any action. And again, that was a great way to, I think, get a message across to the police officers going back out to help the people that we were there to serve.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's essentially, it's unfortunately, some people think sometimes, oh, it's an occupying army. No, of course, you're going to have your knuckleheads, but that's every job. Most of the time, though, it's exactly what you said. I'm here for you. I'm here because I want to help you. I want you to be able to live peaceably here. I want you to be able to raise your family here. And the fact that, again, somebody was willing to call, it speaks to that. And I had somebody tell me this recently. Most of the people that are watching you patrol these neighborhoods, generally speaking, they're on your side. They want you there. They like having you there. Even if they don't say it, they're glad you're there.
Yeah. Yeah, and most cops are there, to, like I said, to do that right job. So the 8-3 was an interesting place. I remember when I first got to the precinct, I had a friend that I got promoted with. He went to the 107th precinct in Queens, and I think I'm there. He was actually promoted 6 months before me. He was promoted sergeant 6 months before, and I had my first homicide. My first night I was in the precinct, and so I called my friend up and I said, I need help doing this report of 49. I said, how do you do this? He says, I haven't had a homicide yet. So he was no help. But what was so interesting, by the end of the week, I think I had 4 homicides.
Jeez.
It was a bad place, the 8-3 in the time. And again, it was mostly drug related, and it was just a horrendous place. Great police officers. There were cops there that were out there every day. I can remember so many. Bill Leahy, he ended up leaving and going to Nassau County, but he went up the ranks in Nassau County, was a great cop. I really had some wonderful, wonderful cops. Unfortunately, as a sergeant, you go to your sergeant training and then you come out to a precinct. It was my first stop, 6 months. And then I went from the fire into the frying pan, from the frying pan into the fire, because I went over to the 7-5 precinct and, to do another 3.5 years, 4 years as a sergeant in the 7-5.
Well, you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you a homicide.
That was the precinct.
Yeah.
It was a rough place. But again, we had great cops.
Yeah, no, of course. And so many of them, and I'll get to them in a second. Of course, Franco Barbario's here. His name's not popping up, but I checked, and it's Franco that said this. Tim, looking good, brother. So he's tuning in tonight. Come on the show, Franco. And another guy that needs to come on the show, and that's Billy Dempsey. Says, looking good, Timmy.
Hey, thanks, Bill.
Quit holding out on me, gentlemen. Come on. You see Timmy here. You're next. Both of you are next. So come on the show. It's not so bad. Hop in. The water's fine. So, and the 7-5, it's funny because think of how many cops that precinct has produced that went into emergency. Mike Curtin, Paulie Perricone, Dave Brink, just to name a few. Those guys all ended up, Joe Vigiano, all those guys ended up in emergency, and all of them did a great job.
Yeah.
Absolute assets to the unit. So it's funny, that precinct really was a breeding ground for some of the best. I think Ronnie Griffith might have been a 7-5 guy too, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know if he was there when I was there, so I don't recall.
Maybe he had a stop there. I know he was in Brooklyn, but I don't think that was the exact precinct. He might have been. Yeah. He might have had a cup of coffee there. So that brings us getting back into emergency now. And now it's a unique spot. And I remember talking about this a while ago with Al Baker. You're in there as a cop first. Now you're a sergeant. And maybe you're not back in the same truck you were in as a police officer, but still you do know these guys. You fly around, you get to know these people. And most of the guys that were there when you were there in your first stint are still there in the unit. And now you got to be the boss. So how uncomfortable was that, if at all? What helped you kind of find your footing now? Back in the unit, you know how to be an E-man, but now you got to be an E-boss.
Yeah. First you brought up the name Al Baker again. Al, one of my mentors, just a great boss and just a good friend. Al was in 10 truck when I was in the 109. And as I said, I was a medic. So we had a car accident, a bad job. I was at the job. I think it was on a pin job one day, and I'm inside the car in uniform, and I'm treating the individual, and 10 truck pulls up. What do you have? I tell him what I have. And when I finish the job, he's like, Al Baker is saying to me, what are you? How are you treating this person in the car? I said, I'm a paramedic. I'm a volunteer firefighter. he said, "You're the kind of guy that we need emergency." And I said, "Al, that's where Sergeant, that's where I'd like to go." And he's the one that's on my application to eventually get into emergency service. So good man. Now the transition, it's not hard. It's not hard because there are good cops in emergency and good cops. I think most of them become good bosses. Our mindset is the same, right? Now the challenge as a boss is to ensure that, and again, is a challenge. I will say it's a challenge because there are people that need supervision everywhere, and sometimes there are cops that don't want to be cops, and it's amazing. Sometimes they get into emergency service. I'll tell you a very short, funny story. Pat Carroll was an inspector. He was in charge of the emergency service at one point, but he was my CO in the 7-5 precinct. He had asked me to go to the SNU unit. I didn't really want to go to the SNU unit, but I was waiting to get into emergency, and I told him, I'm trying to get back to emergency service. What? I don't know if I want to give you a commitment, and I'm, not going to be able to go to emergency service. And he said, you really got to do something. You've been a sergeant for a couple of years now. This is an opportunity you ought to take, and I'll ask you to give me a 2-year commitment. And I said, what do I do now? So, of course, you kind of have to say yes. I said, yes, I'll do it. When I went in to tell him that I was being transferred to emergency service, he said, oh, no, I'm not going to allow that. Like, what are you kidding me? And so I ended up just showing up to emergency service. I had the order. I'm showing up to emergency service. And, that day he was transferred in as the CO, and he saw me and he started laughing. So, just a funny thing. But you know what, Mike, good cops, what is really good is you got to know them as police officers. Now you knew their strengths and their weaknesses. You tried to motivate them to work at their weaknesses to get better and share their strengths with everyone else. That was really the key to what we do as bosses, right? Just try to use your personnel in a way that you can better them as police officers.
Mm-hmm. And procedures have changed too throughout the 80s in terms of how to handle EDPs. Tools and new equipment are coming in. The times are evolving in the unit too, which is nice to see. Now, I wanted to mention, if you weren't working for this, it's fine, but you mentioned nor'easters earlier. There was a really bad storm in Queens in the early 90s. If you remember, of course, I think Jackson Heights particularly was brutalized with flooding. Did you have any role in that response at all, or not really? I know you were in Truck 7 by this point.
Yeah, and I said, like I said, we were riding down the streets in jet skis because of the flooding that was going on. So
not bad.
Yeah, it certainly made for interesting days.
Yeah,
my wife laughed. I'm gonna say, hurricanes, and we were working down at Floyd Bennett Field. We wanted to go out on the jet skis. It gave us great training. People are saying you're crazy. What are you doing? But it's amazing. Those boats will handle a lot of rough seas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
That made us ready for when we had those disasters.
Of course, because you never know what's going to happen. And especially with the weather in New York City, forget all the other jobs in a city of 8 million people. For those of you that I'm sure you know, New York City, it's technically the biggest island because especially Manhattan, the bodies of water it's surrounded by, it makes conditions so sometimes, for lack of a better way to put it, disastrous. You're going to get tested. And as you can attest to, as both a police officer in the unit and a sergeant, you better be ready. You better be ready. So, of course, now you got a couple years, I should say, as a sergeant back in the unit. Now you got back in 91. You're in 7 Truck. Before I get to a major event in your career, arguably the biggest moment in your career as an E-man, 7 Truck, as they say, feeling lucky. Different location, of course. It's in Brooklyn. You're covering a unique area. I think part of it is the 7-5. A lot more tactical jobs and rescue jobs here. Was it a good balance? What was the?
I think there was a good balance, primarily because we were on the border still of the Interborough Parkway. That leads right into the 75th precinct, right? So we still had a number of those rescue jobs, but obviously a lot more tactical work that was going on, right? And when I got back into the unit, 9 Truck had moved to the 113 precinct. 7 Truck was reactivated. And so 7 Truck was an all Brooklyn truck at that point. And so we covered all of those Brooklyn precincts, Brownsville, East New York. It was, quite a busy time.
I can imagine. You know, again, this was during the safe street, safer city era too, when an emphasis was being put on not only having police on the street, but be a bit more proactive. Ray Kelly had just come in for his first stint as police commissioner, and he's encouraging this. And as these cops are getting more and more active, well, they're already active, but they're being encouraged to be even more active. Emergency's getting more active too, because again, you guys are already active as it is, but it means a lot more times, more times often than not, these police officers on the beat are calling you for these types of jobs. Barricaded perks, man with a gun. I mean, it's I don't want to say it's heaven because it's a little bit messed up what's going on. Of course, you're not happy these crimes are happening, but if you want to be a busy cop, hey, it's basically a cop's nirvana.
Yeah, and you know, and again, on the other side of that, Mike, you wanted to get to a job and you wanted to have a good ending, and a good ending is one where there's nobody shot, and where, you know, we have gotten the perpetrator in custody, and the people he may have been threatened are safe. That was really, and most jobs go like that.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the gun jobs that I've been on, that's how they go.
Of course, you know, and I remember telling this to Joe Dolan. I had him on for my Bomb Squad miniseries, but we were talking about his time.
7-truck cop.
Yep,
Great
another
cop.
7-truck cop. But of course, his major job in 1997 with Dave Martinez. But he was on that job where Joe Guerra was shot in 2000. Joe Guerra was on the show previously as well. And, you know, another great guy. And one thing I said when I interviewed Joe, and we were talking about that particular incident, is you have to understand, and most of you in the audience, you know the NYPD, or your former members or current members of the NYPD, so you get this. But nevertheless, for a portion of the audience that may not, sometimes it's portrayed in movies and television shows as shoot them up, bang them up, you know, cops and robbers, OK Corral type deal. You know, the last resort for an emergency cop is for them to shoot you. If they decide we're going to shoot this guy, it's because you have exhausted every, and I mean every last resort that they have, because they will literally go through all of them to not kill you. And you know what? It speaks to the commitment and the restraint of the unit. Even though they're dressed up in all that tactical gear, you guys aren't cowboys. You want things to go as peaceful. You want to take them alive. You want everybody, including the perp, to be okay. And that's a testament to the strength of the unit, which is still on display to this day. So now this is, you know, there are sometimes I go into a show and I don't know what the highlight of it's going to be, because there's many great stories to be told, and you've been telling a lot of great stories tonight, but I think I know what the highlight's going to be here, because like I said, of all the things you did across your 20 years in the NYPD, not even including ESU, this was a definitive moment. It's February 26, 1993. We hit 30 years since this event this year. And just after noon, a call for an explosion at the World Trade Center comes in. You take it from there.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, I'm going to say I was on the unfortunate side of having too many big jobs through my career, like so many that were in the job at that point. But it's still a lot more than just this job. But, you know, we'll talk about the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. Interesting. I was in Sergeant in Charge Truck 7 at the time. It was our day tour. We were in quarters. Guys were getting out, getting ready to, you know, do their job. I assigned Adam Carr, Boy Carr. They went out on patrol. I was working with Bob Schoenbach, police officer, little older gentleman, but I'm going to say again, very fortunate to have Bob in the squad, and Bob was just a great cop. He was a person of very calm demeanor and unbelievable talent and skills. So we're in the truck, and this job comes over, and of course, everybody wants to go. I think the citywide supervisor had said at that point a number of cars had already gone in. I think our Boy car was directly assigned to go in, but they asked the Brooklyn and Queens trucks to kind of cover the whole city and stay back in your area. And so obviously then you say, oh, I'm a little discouraged. Here we are. You know, we'd like to be going in on this job. That's what every emergency cop wants to do. You hear a big job, you want to get in on it. In any event, the job is starting to progress. We had gone to a couple of smaller jobs. We were responding because now many of the trucks were responding into the World Trade Center, and we had to cover, you know, a very big area. Lo and behold, they're now calling for an aviation unit. But first, they thought it might have been a building collapse or a train collision, not just a bombing. They didn't think it was a bombing early on. Now we're getting a call that the building is on fire and heavy smoke inside both the trade centers, and they decide they're going to activate the high-rise rescue plan. Part of that high-rise rescue plan is for NYPD Aviation to get engaged fly to the location. If there are rooftop rescues that have to be made, they would land on a roof, put emergency cops on the roof, and they would start to support the fire department that would come in to help fight that fire. So Bob, being the chauffeur of the truck, we were really close by to Floyd Bennett Field at the time, which is where we house our aviation units. The weather was a little inclement that day. If you remember, it was a little snowy, little overcast. And so I don't know if they were out on patrol, but the main rescue helicopter was in quarters. And so as they're calling for this high-rise rescue, part of the plan is for one of the emergency trucks to respond to Floyd Bennett Field so that we can get on the airship so that we can be ready to perform rescues if that were to come about. And so Bob Schoenbeck, myself, I think it was Joe Zogby and Bob Grogan that also got there in the Adam car or the boy car. And so the four of us boarded the 412. We were on the airship with pilot Greg Semendinger, Tom DeFresco, and the crew chief, Rich Trottier. And so 7 of us on the ship, we're flying into Manhattan. Now, we loaded the ship with equipment, right? SCBAs, forcible entry equipment, different things, rope rescue equipment in case we had to do that. And we fly into Manhattan, and the first thing Greg Semendinger was told to do was land so that I guess they could offload some things and then they would think about conducting a survey. And so he asked us all to get out of the ship. And I said to him that, I could be the eyes and ears for the rescue team. So I'd like to stay on the ship. In the meantime, we had rigged the ship so that we could do a rappel, which was part of the high-rise rescue plan. So the pilot allowed myself and Bob Schoenbeck to stay on the ship. We flew up then to do a survey. The cloud cover was such that we could get up and see the rooftops of the buildings. We could see there was one of the towers had a platform on top that actually is a place where the helicopter could land in the center of a platform. That building, people were outside on the roof. The other building had the antenna, and there was nobody on the roof. And that was really the building that was filled with most of the smoke. You could see most of the smoke was in that tower. And so I said to the pilot, that's the building that needs our help. We should rappel 2 people down. And he said, okay. He flew over the corner of the building. I went out of the ship. Bobby followed me, and we started rooftop operations. What was a little funny about this whole thing, they had asked us to take all of our equipment out. So now I had my Leatherman tool, my gun belt, my flashlight, and my Laracus harness. I came out of the ship, and we landed on the roof. Luckily, I had that Leatherman because there is a door on the 110th floor. Mike, another, just funny thing. You live in New York your whole life, and you think you'll go see some of these sites in New York. I had never been in the Twin Towers.
Really?
The first time I ever entered the Twin Towers was through the 110th floor roof. And so we got to the door, and like I said, lucky I had my Leatherman because I had to actually break the door lock in order to get into the building. And as soon as I opened up the door, heavy smoke was coming out of the building. And so we get on our hands and knees and we're crawling in. And one of the first things we found was one of the fire station carts. The Port Authority had these carts in the building at strategic locations. I wheeled the cart to the door, opened it up, and there are SCBAs in there and tools. So now at least we could put on an SCBA and start to work. I assigned Bobby Schoenbeck to start to take down the antennas on the corner of the roof, just so that we could possibly get a helicopter to land on that roof because I felt we would be doing rooftop rescues. And I went in to start doing some searches. On that 110th floor, that's where some of the radio rooms are and some offices. I came to an office and there were wet towels in front of the door. So I knew people were behind that door. We opened up the door. There were a number of people behind the door. One was a pregnant female, very concerned. I will say that I had a conversation with her, very personal, because my wife was pregnant about the same amount of time as she was. She was pregnant maybe 7 or 8 months. She was very concerned for her baby. I told her I understood. I have a pregnant wife at home, and we're going to take care of you, and we're going to get you down safely. It ends up we exited the building. We put people out on the roof. We got their jackets, I continued to go in and go floor to floor. I did a number of searches by myself, primarily because Bob was on the roof now trying to get those antennas down. I would continue to direct people up to the roof. Eventually, and what was difficult, the helicopter couldn't come immediately back up because after we repelled, the cloud cover came down and they didn't have sight of the building. And so there were no more rappels and there was no more ferrying of people back and forth to the roof. I think it took about 45 minutes for the cloud cover to clear a little bit, and it allowed for that next group of people to rappel. I think that's when Joe Zogby, Bob Grogan, Dave Isaacson, Mike Curtin, Ron Harris, Charlie Molinet, Don LaSala, and Ron Klopa, all came in and started some of these rooftop operations. And I think there was only 2 people that rappelled, because after that rappel, they continued to help clearing the roof. And the next trip the helicopter made up, they were able to do a landing on the roof. And so the cops were able to get off. We were able to, get more and more people up. And we now had a rooftop operation at One World Trade Center.
Incredible. Incredible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And this is interesting in that to this point, and you weren't a stranger to terrorism. You were in ESU, like I said earlier, during the 80s when there were numerous domestic terrorist bombings going on in the city. But this was a new form of terrorism that it was overseas. So let me ask you, as a sergeant in the unit, you're always game planning regardless. You're always going over things with your officers. You're always studying things on your own personal time to make sure your men and your women are safe in the unit and that plans can go forward without a hitch. But when it came specifically to terrorism, how did it change your way of game planning and coming up with methods after something of this nature and after something to this point, like I said, in the city's history, was unheard of?
Yeah. Mike, what's funny? We were dealing with drug issues and other kinds of crimes, and they would set up booby traps to get cops that were trying to make entry. And so we had that mindset already that we had to use more caution. The terrorism issues, and you said it, you look at the history of New York, and anybody that's a student of being a police officer, you have to be a student of understanding the job and what you can be coming into, right? A wagon planted with bombs back in the 1800s blew up in Lower Manhattan, right? You understand this history, you know that this is something that you have to be ready for. This was a little bit more than that, wasn't it? We had made these plans for rooftop rescue operations, working in conjunction with the fire department, City of New York. Obviously, we had plans that we could work with the fire department, City of New York. That's another funny thing. People talk about the interaction between NYPD and FDNY. I know you might recall Macaulay Culkin's apartment fire that was in Midtown Manhattan a number of years ago. I was working down at Floyd Bennett Field at the time, and they were calling for additional help. They had a problem because it was a pretty big fire, and there were people in the building. And so they're trying to get people into the building. But it was the first time that I was at a fire scene where a fire chief actually ordered me into the building. Got to the scene, told them, we had Scott packs on, told them, we're here to help. Where do you want us? And he sent us right in. He told us to go to some upper floors and start doing some evacuations of people. So there is a working relationship with the fire department and police department. There were certainly differences, right? We didn't have turnout gear. So to go into that fire room is a far different story, right? The brave people that do that are firemen in New York City Fire Department. And so this was an area, these high-rise rescues, and certainly it was a terrorist event, but there were people that were trapped in the building. The fire department is not waiting outside to see, what's going on, where the extra bombs are, right? We had people looking for secondary devices in the World Trade Center. We did our rescue operations, and the fire department entered that building doing rescue operations. So, that's what we're here to do. We learned some things from this. I mean, we were certainly a little discouraged after the fact because we knew what the terrorists wanted. They wanted to take these buildings down. They didn't succeed this time. And I will say, we worked very closely with Port Authority, City of New York, and New Jersey in order to plan for being better prepared for another event. And so we did high-angle rope rescues, and terrorism training with Port Authority police in order to get better prepared for that. Mike, it's going to move me to another area that I think when you talk about terrorism, we really need to understand all of the facets of it, right? So the bombing was in 1993. 1995, the Aum Shinrikyo attacked a subway in Tokyo.
Yes.
They attacked with sarin gas.
Mhm.
And sarin is a product that we didn't really understand in the police department. We knew a little bit about hazardous materials. And I had two great guys working for me in hazmat, Charlie Rupert, Pat Pogan. Charlie Rupert, both of these guys were top in their field. It's unbelievable what I learned from these two guys. So we're on the phone. We're all off duty when that incident happened, but we're all on the phone off duty saying, what is this? What are we doing? How do we learn more about it? Charlie knew of a cop in a 3 truck, Seth Garr. Seth was in a reserve unit, and he was actually, he knew of the 320th Chemical Corps, which was stationed in Queens. He connected us with some people. We went to the 320th Corps, 320th Corps, Chemical Corps unit, and we got information on these chemicals. And so we together started to really try to educate ourselves on the potential. That led us to learning that there is an Army Chemical School in Anniston, Alabama. We wrote the Pentagon in order to get permission. We were part of the first civilian group to go through this Army Chemical School in 1995. And that propelled us to really learn more about all kinds of terrorism. And so we continued to expand on trying to understand what else could we be impacted by. And so there were a number of schools that we started to attend. Tooele in Utah was on biological weapons. We went to Tooele. We learned about the radiological nuclear training test site in Nevada. We started to train on dirty bombs and nuclear bombs, atomic bombs. We then also learned about a bomb school in New Mexico. New Mexico Tech had a school specific for bombings. And so they started to put together training specific for terrorist bombings. That's how we progressed to get better. And, Mike, I said to you earlier, these are all classes that we then continued to offer emergency service police officers. They would go to New Mexico Tech. They would go to the Center for Domestic Preparedness now, that's run by Homeland Security. It's a chemical training school for first responders. They go out to Nevada test site on radiologicals. These emergency cops have great training in understanding, first, terrorism, second, the weapons that terrorist can use. And that was, all started because of, like I said, some great people that we had in emergency service. I couldn't tell you enough about Pat Pogan and Charlie Rupert. Both of them, parents, grandparents that were on the job. I think Charlie Rupert's grandfather was in the original gun squad. Just a great history and not good police officers, Mike, great police officers. These guys, and I talk about big guys in the past. I was very fortunate to have these two guys working with me. They were both very big, 6'4", 6'3", big guys. I came to a door, and I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'9", and these guys would be in front of me, and most of the time people would just put their hands up. It's just a great team of guys. But knowledge was unbelievable. Historical knowledge, research capabilities. Pat Pogan, unbelievable in the way that he would really research information. And to this day, the man just doesn't forget anything. He's got the memory of an elephant.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. He's been on this show. I kid you not, there are two people that hold the record for the longest interviews in the history of this show. Originally, it was Don Sadawi from the Bomb Squad. Pat broke his record. Pat's record is 3 hours and 12 minutes. I kid you not. So Pat is the longest interview I've ever done. That was last year. And you're right. He was rattling off. I think I only said 5 words maximum during that podcast because he was going from story to story to story to story. I'm like, all right, you drive it.
And Mike, that's my point. I'm going to say most emergency cops, many of them aren't going to stand up and speak now. Both Pat and Charlie, they were trainers. They taught hazmat. They taught some of these terrorism courses, as we moved on. Many guys want to do. teaching is a whole nother field. We are very fortunate that there are so many guys that, expanded their knowledge base and wanted to share that in a certifying way. And that's how emergency service continued to grow in certifications. When I started working at Floyd Bennett Field, we started to get everybody certified police instructors that were training with us. And then we would get them the license specific to the areas that they were training. So Pat, Charlie, these guys that were teaching in hazmat, they went to the State Fire Academy to become hazmat specialists. They went to specialty courses to advance their specialties in those hazardous materials. When the weapons of mass destruction went out, they're the ones that actually initiated this training. Charlie Rupert was one of the original contributors to the weapon of mass destruction training programs that went national and international. Just outstanding people that come to this unit and share their knowledge in order to get other first responders prepared to respond to these terrible events, right? Mm-hmm. And it really is unbelievable the ability that they had.
No, preparedness is everything. Obviously Pat's been on the show, like I said. Is Charlie Rupert still with us?
Yes.
Okay. If you have his contact information, well, you can. If you keep in touch with him regularly, you can give him my contact information. I'd love to get Charlie on the show if he's willing. I think he'd be a great interview if I'm able to speak with him. A couple of jobs I want to ask you about. Thank you for explaining that, because it is true. Emergency is well trained in multiple different facets, and you need to be, because look at where you work. Like I said, 8 million, different scenarios with 8 million people all living in one place. But these jobs were in Brooklyn. 1992 Crown Heights. Did you have any role in that?
We responded to that job. That Richie Teamsma was on that job. That was the backpack bomb, correct?
Well, there was that, but there was also a riot going on around that time.
Oh yeah, the riots.
Yes, Crown Heights riots. Well, the other one was in Washington Heights. But actually, no. Listen, I can't gloss over that backpack bomb. What happened there?
Again, that job was they were going to terrorize the subways. They were going to bring a backpack to the subways. Rich Teamsma, that was his job in the bomb squad.
Yes, 1997. Yes, I know what you're talking about now.
Rich and I were partners for a while in emergency. We were in 9 truck together. I was just so fortunate to have some really great people to work with. Rich Teamsma, I was a fast guy. I was a little bit athletic. I think I ran the obstacle course when I got out of the academy faster than anybody ever had done it. Right.
Nice.
I was a little guy and I was fast. Always pretty athletic, and thought I was pretty strong and could do things. We get a pin job one day, Richie and I, on the Belt Parkway, and the traffic is so bad and it's around another bridge, so we have to park before the bridge. The traffic is all backed up. People pulled to the side and it's stuck under the bridge. We can't get around. So I go to the back of the truck and I tell Richie, I'm going to grab a first aid bag. I'm thinking like a paramedic, and I'll grab an axe and a Halligan. Richie said, okay, I'll grab a couple of tools and I'll meet you there. Now I'm running. I have the first aid bag and a couple of hand tools. And I get to the car and I put the bag down, and Richie is right there, and he's got the Hearst engine on one shoulder and the Hearst tool on the other. So, just a monster of a man. He was just tremendous. Great background he had a great background in the U.S. Marines, and then went on to work, I think, in the airport industry as a mechanic. Richie could, take anything apart and put anything together. But great guy. Went off to the bomb squad. Still a good friend. He's just a wonderful, wonderful man.
Yes. And that job, ESU was well represented there because, like I said, it wasn't just these two I'm about to mention. It was a team from 7 Truck. But Joe Dolan and Dave Martinez have both been on the show previously, talking about that job, and then for their own separate interviews, of course, they did a great job that night. Paul Yerkou, another former E-man, he was in, he was in on that job too. So great job all around.
Well, actually, he was shot at.
1989.
Quick as he was flying in, we flew over to that job. Paul is a great person, another great cop. The sad thing is some of these guys move on to go to other interests. A loss to emergency service, certainly. but a benefit to NYPD. Paul going over to the bomb squad with Richie. Great guys.
And it's funny because ESU's tentacles is all over this podcast alone. Because again, my Bomb Squad miniseries, Tales from the Boom Room, half the guys I've interviewed for that miniseries that have been in the Bomb Squad previously were in emergency service. Paul, Richie, Paulie Perricone, Kevin Barry, just Eddie Hayes, just to name a few. Quite a number of guys that eventually found their way over to Truck 11, shall we say. And they call it Truck 11 because so many of the guys in that unit are former E-men. Another job that happened in Brooklyn, and if you weren't there for this, it's fine. We can move forward. But December of 1994, robbery comes over the air in the 6-9 precinct, I believe, in a bike shop. Ray Cannon and his partner go there, and these animals shoot Ray in the face and kill him. He had just gotten married 2 months prior. Were you there for that job?
Very sad. No, I wasn't working on that day.
Okay. Yeah, very sad indeed. ESU did a great job there. Transit Rescue was there for that one, too. They came in. They must have been nearby. And that brings us to the spring of 1995 because you have a really good problem on your hands in that the unit's getting bigger because Housing Rescue, which had been on loan to you guys anyway for the last 8 months or so, now it's official. Now they're in the unit because the entire Housing Police has merged with the NYPD. And the Transit Police's Emergency Medical Rescue Unit's coming over. And all those guys that were in Transit Rescue are now going to be in ESU. I know 7 got a few guys. John Bushing, I remember him telling me he went over to 7 upon the merge. So you're getting these really, really skilled cops in a specific niche area. The housing rescue cops knew the projects pretty well. Obviously, the transit rescue cops knew the subways pretty well. So that period where you got your guys already who you've been working with as it was, and now you got these guys coming over. It's a good problem because it's a lot happening all at once, but they're very skilled. So as a sergeant in 7 Truck alone, how are you navigating it?
Now, again, it was a benefit to us, right? Especially, as you know, subways are all over New York, and another big part of our rescues, right? It's a big part of it. Tremendous assets that came across. Mike, you may know that many of the transit police officers were called off the top of the lists, and so there are a lot of smart people that came across from transit. And some of them came across as bosses. We had some great bosses, both from housing and from transit that came into the unit. And it just helped the unit learn more about those specific areas, right? The housing projects and the subways, right? Up and down police and the back and forth police, right?
Absolutely. And again, they fit in well. And Anita Rosado is going to be on the show next month, and she was telling me how funny, that 2 transit cops ended up having such a big role in the STS, her and Bushing. And again, look at the expertise they provided. Yeah,
John Bushing, again, a great guy, great asset to the unit. John, past chief from Rockville Center Fire Department, just again, everyone you're mentioning, just outstanding individuals.
Yeah, and Anita, I say this lovingly when I met her down for Rima Day at Floyd Bennett. She reminds me of all my Puerto Rican aunts. She's small, but she's very feisty. She did well for herself at ESU.
Great cop, Anita, yep.
Yes, she'll tell me all about it next month. So let's talk about the RMI for a second, because this is something I didn't want to gloss over either. Now, it was introduced for some context. The bomb squad got 2 of them because New Year's Eve 1982, a bombing occurred at one police plaza. 3 police officers, 2 of them from the bomb squad, Tony Sempt rather, and Richie Pastorella were critically injured, as well as a 3rd police officer who wasn't in the bomb squad. He was on patrol at 1 PP. So the bomb squad got 2 RMIs. ESU got 1 at the time. Then it expanded to 2. There's 1 in 2 Truck, and then there's 1, of course, out in Queens at 10 Truck. So as far as your function, because I know in the 90s it was rewritten. John DeLera had a big hand in rewriting the operations manual. The RMI, Remote Mobile Investigator, tell me about your role specifically in that, because it's a very unique tool.
Yeah. So I told you the story about Pat Carroll, becoming the CEO of Emergency. And, of course, I'm working under Pat Carroll, and I'm in Emergency a couple of years again now, out of the truck, had a great time out there. But we had a sergeant that retired out of the Hazardous Materials Unit, and I think Paul Hargrove decided that he was going to go back to the truck. And so that opened up RMI. Pat Carroll asked me to take over both those units, the hazmat and the robots, and they were well-versed units. I'm going to say, again, every police officer in emergency service is trained as a hazardous material technician, certified, DEP certified hazmat technicians, and the robot program, a great program. Again, I think we were one of the early units in police departments using them for tactical work, right? getting into a place so that we could see if, there's something that's going on without putting a police officer at risk. And so when I got in, the unit was really pretty smooth. John DeLara, a great cop from up in Two Truck, was a big part of our training program for the robot unit. Typically, and it was something that really worked very well in emergency service, we would have police officers and instructors that would come in part-time. And the rest of the time they're out in the job in the truck. And that's a great way to be, because they're out there every day. They're not getting stale. And then on occasion they come in to run a program. And so whenever we ran a robot training program, we would normally run training programs for people that worked in the trucks that had the robots, 10 truck and 2 truck. So you were new to emergency service, you went through your regular emergency service training, you went off to the truck. When we had a class, a few guys that we could then come into the class, we'd bring you back to Floyd Bennett Field, and we'd do a robot training program. And so John DeLara would come in, we'd work together, and we'd start doing the training on the robot program. Just a great program. I will say that I was involved in budgeting, in purchasing new robots. We actually purchased some of the first tracked robots. So it was great working with the company. They were down in Tennessee. We actually traveled to Tennessee to work with them on building the robots themselves. We came back with the robots. We really had to learn all the intricacies of the robot itself, because you needed people to also maintain it, right? And so we had these robots that we could use tactically. I will say I went to a job up in White Plains. There was a police officer that was shot and killed up there in White Plains, and they asked us to come in with a robot. I'm not sure of the time on this. I didn't look this one up, Mike. I looked
1996.
Yeah.
I think I know the job you're talking about. I'm gonna get the officer's name momentarily. Was this Eastchester?
It was Eastchester, yes.
Yeah, 1996.
Yeah, so we went up there and we ended up backing the van almost to the front door, deploying the robot out the back of the van. It was able to go up the staircase of the front door. It was able to gain access through that front door. It was able to get into the first floor, do a survey of the first floor. We didn't find individual on the first floor. It then went up the stairs. Actually, I think at the top of the stairs, we got stuck for a little bit, but it was able then to manipulate its way around upstairs and get into Michael Frey. Yeah, it was able to get into doorways, and we actually found the perpetrator had committed suicide. But
coward.
Yeah, again, a great tool. We used it on a number of occasions. I went to a number of shooting events with it that we could get in. The other thing that we started to utilize the robot for were hazardous material incidences. As you know, why dress out a police officer in self-contained breathing apparatus and these level A suits when we can send a robot in to do the job and just decon the robot, right? So we started to interact with hazardous material incidences and finding new ways that we might be able to use those robots. So we went on a number of tactical jobs and intermingled, our resources in order to come out to solutions, problems that we might be able to face.
Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned to you earlier, cops really got skilled in how to operate it. And John particularly, it was his baby. Because for those of you that may not be familiar, if you ever, and there's 4 episodes. The other 2 I haven't seen. They're not available anywhere, at least not yet. But there's 2 episodes that are on YouTube of when cops filmed in New York City with the NYPD in 1994. And in the beginning, when they're doing the Bad Boys opening, right before they get to the little chorus line, there's a brief video of John driving the RMI. And it's funny. You can go on YouTube. You could just see that little clip of him driving it, because he was pretty skilled with it. This is a little bit of a lighthearted thing I wanted to ask you about, because I'm such a nerd for this stuff. You guys had worn the powder blue, as I call them, Kansas City Royal Blue uniforms for a long time with the emergency ball cap. Then you have that switch in 1995 on over to navy blue, which is what you wore for the last 6 years before you retired in 2001 out of ESU. So switching from those uniforms into, I guess, what's still the uniform for ESU to this day, I personally prefer the latter, but tell me, which one did you prefer, and what was that switch like for you?
Um, you know, I got in the police department. It was a light blue shirt. There were people that complained about the shirt and the tie, but it was certainly a way to present itself. Mike, I think of growing up in Williston Park, and when we go to church, we would dress in the Sunday best. My father would dress and put on a tie, right?
Right.
Interestingly, my father-in-law, when he'd go to work, he worked at Sperry Corporation building and Grumman, actually building one of the landers that landed on the moon. He would go to work, but he would put on coveralls when he got to work. He went to work in a shirt and tie, right? You look at people that went to ball games years ago, they went to ball games in a shirt and tie. It was a way for police officers to present themselves to people and say, you know, we're here, we're people, and we're professionals, and we want to handle whatever problem you may have in a professional way. Most of the time, it's to help people, right? So that uniform was okay to me. The switch, I think everybody liked the newer uniform. I certainly thought it was better tactically for us. I can think of a time that I was wearing that light blue shirt. Commissioner Safer was commissioner when we were working with the weapon of mass destructions, trying to understand the
Yes.
sarin jobs back in 1995. I don't think we had switched yet to the.
Well, no, Bratton was, because Safer came in 96. Bratton was still commissioner in 95.
Yeah. So I know at the time I was really working very closely with our partners in the Army and Department of Energy on these programs. And I was reporting to Commissioner Safer. I was called into his office and would meet with executive staff, and we would be discussing how NYPD could better prepare, one, to prevent these types of incidents, and two, respond to them. And that's really how we got involved in getting the training, because we had, you know, an open door right to the top of the police department. But I get called to a meeting one day. I actually got a notification that I was supposed to go to a meeting. I didn't get the notification. I won't give names away, but my CO at the time was wondering why I was going to, and it wasn't Pat Carroll, but was wondering why I was getting invited to the police commissioner's office. And so he didn't give me the notification, and he went to the police commissioner's office himself to answer the questions. And I was a citywide supervisor. I think this day we had a person under a train, and I get to that job, and I'm under the train with the cops, and we're doing our work, and I get out, and I'm a filthy mess, and I get a call on the radio, report to the commissioner's office forthwith. So I go right to the commissioner's office. Normally, I would like to look professional when I went there, and I remember I was covered in grease and mud and muck. And I walk into the commissioner's office, and the CO is sitting there, and there's a bunch of executive police people sitting at the commissioner's conference table. And he asked if I had gotten the notification. I said I didn't get a notification today. He said, okay. He turned to my CO. Did he get the notification? And my CO said, no, I thought you wanted, me here to represent emergency. And he said, well, why didn't you give him the notification? And then he asked my CO to step out, and he asked me to sit down. And so I sat down, and I was, like I said, a greasy mess, but he certainly understood. And I continued to work with Commissioner Safer. It's funny, when I got back to emergency, that boss asked me, I want to know everything you know. Now, Mike, that's very hard. People come with different experiences, as I've already expressed here. Mm-hmm. And I was a little upset with this boss, first for not telling me this and embarrassing me that I was not notified to go to a meeting that the commissioner had asked me to be at. So when he asked me, I was a little rude back. I said, where do you want me to start? You want to know everything I know? You want me to start at kindergarten? You want me to start sooner? So, yeah, interesting. But, the uniform, certainly the new uniform, I think it was appropriate. You don't have badges hanging off. You don't have things that get caught. It was tactically, a better uniform. So, nice uniform.
Yeah, Absolutely. And there's that little mix again, to go back to those cops episodes. There's a little mixture going on because when they filmed in 94, you guys were just starting to wear those. So some guys have them on already. Some guys are still in the Kansas City Royal Blue. So that switch, there's a little hybrid moment there where the fleets were, or the uniform style, I should say, was overlapping. Howard Blanks in the chat from Taru to the Ray Cannon job. He was in EMS at the time. He says, I removed Ray and later removed the DOA perp. So small world there. Howard will be on the show in October. And Carl Duenzel is here. I haven't talked to Carl in a little bit. How you doing,
Hey,
buddy?
Carl,
good evening,
good to
gentlemen.
see you.
He says, good evening, gentlemen. Sergeant Farrell's a good man and was a great boss. Good to see you, buddy. Hope
Thank
all's
you,
well
Carl.
with you. Carl's doing great for himself in the private sector. A few more things. I don't want to keep you too long. Of course, it brings us into, of course, the new millennium 2000 comes around. The Y2K phase goes out. Off with, everything went off without a hitch there. There was the Joe Guerra job, and I don't know if you were at that one at all when he was shot during that standoff. Did you have a role in that? I know that was in Six Trucks area. But...
Yeah, no, I wasn't at that job either.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So that rolls us into 2001 and July of 2001 specifically. Now, again, pretty much all of your police career, if you combine the two stints, it's about 14 of your 20 years in emergency. And it seems like you're having a lot of fun. And some guys leave because they just know it's time. Some guys leave because there's something in the private sector that they just can't pass up. It's too good to turn down. What was the reason that originally in July of 01, before we get to 9/11, you said, you know what? Had my fun, time to go?
I'm going to get to that in a minute, Mike. Can you hold that question? Because I
Sure.
want to go back a half a step.
Yeah, let's go back.
I only think that it's interesting how things happen in life and how we're connected to people. And, I think the little town I'm from, it really has produced some wonderful police officers and firefighters. And so, that New York City ESU is part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency Urban Search and Rescue Task Force.
Yes.
My Corps, myself, we were instrumental in getting that off and started. We were called in to help work with that. The fire department became aware of that. They obviously then got engaged with it. When they decided to create a New York team, they said it's going to be a joint team. They were so impressed with what emergency service could do that they knew that we had to be involved in an urban search and rescue team. And so we started working and building in order to be prepared and have the right qualifications. Now, many of us were volunteer firefighters, so we had a number of people that had fire training, and that was a big thing with fire departments around the globe, saying, well, you really need to have some of this fire training. But when you look at urban search and rescue and looking at earthquakes and building collapses, a lot of times you're not in full turnout gear when you're doing some of that rescue work. If there's no fire impingement, that can really be taxing on your body, right? So you would dress a little bit differently. And that's the uniforms of the urban search and rescue are different than full turnout gear, right? And so we started to build this team. And surprisingly, Mike, I will tell you, most emergency cops met or exceeded the training required for those rescue teams. And so we did some additional training. We did some more rubble training in extrication and search and collapse buildings and rubble. Now, we have been doing that for years. There's a lot of big buildings in New York, and we've had a lot of collapses yes. in subways, trains that come off the track and, collapse part of the subway stations. We've been working in that for years before this urban search and rescue came out. Lo and behold, we have a team that is up and running. We have the equipment. We're all ready to go. And we had the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995.
Yes.
We're contacted, and immediately we say we're ready to go. So they're going to mobilize the team. We gather a team. I think it was 54 people at the time, half FDNY, half NYPD. We all met at Floyd Bennett Field. We went through pre-medicals. We're trying to arrange getting a flight. We finally got a military flight to get down to Oklahoma City. I think we went into Tillis Air Force Base in Oklahoma and then got over to Oklahoma City. Mike, it was really some experience. I think we were up for 28 or 30 hours straight. We had gotten there and they asked us to do midnight. So we didn't get to sleep. And now they're telling us we're going to do the midnight tour. And nobody shook their head. Everybody went out on the pile. I think we were very fortunate. We were on the pile for 10 days. One injury, one cop slipped in the shower at the end of that tour. Got a few stitches, went right back to work. It was that kind of job. I'm going to say it was just a very sad day because here terrorism came to our shores again, and we're down there searching. As we're searching, most of us had some good experience, and we're really thinking this is it's going to be difficult to find anybody alive in what we were surveying. And as we started to do some of the rescues, we were down there. Now that this is the next day, right? So most of the people that were rescued that were going to be rescued were pulled out already. As we're working, Mike Curtin and the team find the blood stripe of a Marine uniform. He knows it's an officer. And Mike says, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving a Marine behind. At the time, we were supposed to mark where bodies were found and continue to do our searches for these live victims. We went to our task force leader, Kurt Wargo. Captain was our leader, Chief Shelley from the fire department. And they went and solicited from the incident commander to say, listen, the likelihood of pulling somebody out alive is very minimal, but this could really mean something to the team and to everybody on this site. We think we have the remains of a Marine officer. We want to get him out. And so we were given permission, and they said, you've got 4 hours to get him out. I'm going to say we had him out in less time. I don't know exactly. It might have been 2.5 hours, but we worked. By the time we had gotten him out, there was some contacts made to a Marine attachment in the area. When we got him out, it was Captain Guzman,
Yes.
who was working at a recruiting office in Oklahoma City. We obviously properly put him into a morgue bag and onto a Stokes basket. And when we were ready to carry him out, an American flag was put over that, and all of the machines outside shut down. Everybody stopped, and the place went silent. It was really an unbelievable experience. That Marine detachment met us, and they marched Guzman off that site. I'm sorry to say, and you know, that Mike Curtin lost his life in the World Trade Center in 2001. Just a very sad state of affairs. Mike talked about, this job and that he wasn't going to leave that Marine behind. I think that's what every emergency cop felt when we got to the pile in the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. We didn't get every body out because there were no bodies to recover, but we got some parts out that we knew where they were. And I say one of the things I do today is I'm trying to live a good and happy life in honor of those members of the emergency service that lost their lives. So I talk about the Oklahoma City bombing a little bit. I'm going to just see if I can show this picture up quick.
Yep.
That's 6 individuals.
Oh, look at Tommy Langone.
Yeah. So these are 6 people that responded to the Oklahoma City bombing. What's significant about those 6 people, they all lived or were in Williston Park. Myself, Dennis O'Connell, Larry Johnson, Bob Schnell, and Steve Berger. They were all also in Williston Park Fire Department. Now, Tom Langone was in Roslyn, a neighboring fire company, but lived in Williston Park. There was one other person, so I just find this amazing. 6 police officers and 1 U.S. Secret Service employee member, Tom Joyce, who actually grew up down the block here from me. I knew we got into the New York City Police Academy together. Tom Joyce came to the Oklahoma City bombing with the U.S. Secret Service. So there were 7 people that grew up in Williston Park that responded to the Oklahoma City bombing.
Wow.
Six of them on the Urban Search and Rescue Task Force. And you did mention Tom Langone. Again, another very sad story. Tom also perished in the 9/11 attack.
So many members of Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 1 were FDNY and NYPD members that perished that day. From the FDNY, certainly Rescue 1. Yeah. Quite a few of their members perished on the NYPD side.
Jack Fanning and
Terry Hatton.
And Terry Hatton, Terry Farrell, right? There was, too much. Again, a sad thing. Mike, police officer, you don't make enough money. You got to do something on the side. On the side, I actually taught in a paramedic program here in Nassau County. I was a volunteer firefighter, I told you, and we have an EMS academy here in Nassau County. I worked for them for many years. I had a great young man in a volunteer fire company in Uniondale. His name was Andre Fletcher. Andre got into the class and he's like, you're a great teacher. I love what you're doing. I want to be a police officer one day. And he ended up getting into the New York City Police Department and then said, how do I get to emergency service? And I told him all the things he would have to do. He's doing all the right things. He wasn't really a person that liked to swim. He took swimming lessons. He was in a volunteer fire company. He was already an AEMT. He knew all this fire training. He finally gets the years of service that he needs in the police department to put his application in. He puts his application in. He calls me. I obviously then sign the application, have Andre get into emergency service. He calls me up. He said, Tim, I just got called to FDNY. I said, Andre, if that's your dream, you have to follow your dream. I'm sorry to say Andre lost his life on 9/11. He was a fire department city in New York, and Andre went into that building like all of our other responders, and Andre lost his life.
And from, like I said, not just him, but looking back at the task force, and I think Andre was one of 12 black firemen to die that day. I was doing my homework on that a little while ago. But going back to task force,
we're red and blue. We're cops and firemen. I don't think it's colors.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just a little historical anecdote that somebody mentioned to me, and I did some homework on a little while ago, which was interesting from that perspective. I think somebody sent me that as a Black History Month article a few months ago. But with the task force, just to get back to that for a second, you mentioned Tom, of course. There's Mike. Claude Richards from the bomb squad was on that task force as well. And he ended up perishing that day too, which I didn't realize until somebody told me about that many years later. But that recovery story came full circle with Mike Curtin because Pete Conlon was on this show last August, and he was down there too. Yes, he told me that story. He says Pete wasn't a Marine himself, but I believe Pete's father was, if I remember correctly. And Mike says to Pete, and I'm paraphrasing, it goes against every fiber in my being to have you here, but your father was in the Corps, and that's good enough for me, so you'll stay here. And sure enough, they were able to help and get that particular gentleman, Officer Guzman, Captain Guzman, out of that pile. And all those years later, when Mike was recovered, because Mike was in Building 6 with John Delara and Claude Richards, when those three gentlemen perished in the collapse, the call comes in, and a gentleman who was in the New York office of the Marine Corps gets the call, and he wrote a great article about this and goes down. And he had originally gone down to a truck, and there's a box, and it has a flag in it, and the flag reads on the side, "This flag is for Sergeant Mike Curtin only, waiting until he was found." And they find him. Ray Kelly, who had just come in as NYPD commissioner himself, former Marine, goes down there, and they all carry him out. That was March 6th, 2002. Yes. So it came full circle for Mike. So the same respectful recovery he gave, he got seven years later.
Mike, he did. And, again, I pray for his wife and his children every day. Wonderful wife, wonderful children. They don't have Mike today, but I think they all look to try to live good lives and impress their father with the lives that they're having. So that's really what matters at this point.
Oh, yeah. Quick little funny story that jogs to my mind that Ronnie Wasson told me a little while ago when he came on a couple years back. That, of course, Mike was a 7.5 guy, and I think Ronnie was in the 7.5 for a little bit too. And after New Year's Eve, what happens? You shoot guns off into the air. It's how New York City was back then. And Ronnie says, so all the cops, stay inside, don't go out because you're going to get into a shooting. Mike Curtin stayed outside. And of course, Mike got into a shooting. And Ronnie says, you know what? I wanted to kill him, but he had this way about him. You just couldn't stay mad at him. Yeah. And that was just Mike Curtin's way. And again, he got to experience both sides of the coin. He was a cop in 7 truck. And when he came back in 1998, he was a sergeant in 2 trucks. So he knew both sides of it too. So really great email.
Both Mike Curtin and Joe Vigiano were cops in the 7.5 when I was there as a sergeant. Great cops and moved on. Joe went to 7 truck. Mike went up to 2 truck, but great cop. And then obviously Mike Curtin got promoted to sergeant, came back to emergency as a sergeant, and was just a great leader, good person.
Absolutely. When you look back on your career, of course, it's hard to say what would have happened or wouldn't have happened had you not retired in July of 2001. And looking back in that manner doesn't really help anybody. But nevertheless, again, it was a 20-year journey that was filled with many, many turns and twists along the way that I'm sure you wouldn't trade for anything. And so much of it, like I said, an emergency. So now that you've been out longer than you were in, 20 in, 22 out, how do you define your career? Because it's a lot to be proud of, Tim.
Thank you. Mike, I think this is probably true to most people that are cops and firefighters. When people say, "Oh, what do you do?" The first thing I typically say is I'm retired from the New York City Police Department. Interestingly, I work for a bank now. It's hard to imagine transitioning from law enforcement to a bank. I will say what's so challenging. When I first got into the police department, I thought one of the benefits was that you could work 20 years, get out, collect half salary, and move on to other things in life. I liked the challenges that I had. I was fortunate because the police department gave me some outstanding training. And because of the counterterrorism work that I was doing for NYPD, I got involved with the Department of Justice and the Department of State and started to do some consulting work for them, working specific in areas of counterterrorism and response to weapon of mass destruction incidences. We actually built a program and went around this country and to some of our foreign countries in order to provide some training through the U.S. Department of State. And it was a great opportunity for me. Because that was taking place right towards the end of my career, I actually transitioned into consulting for a number of companies doing that training around this country and in some of these foreign countries. I was consulting at first. My wife had said, one of the things that you were going to do when you got to your 20 years was retire. I actually stayed almost a year longer, Mike, because I did have some difficulty trying to separate from the police department. And finally, I had young children at the time. I said, my wife is right. I'm running all over the place. I'm working 2 jobs. Maybe I can really focus on giving my children a little bit more. And so I decided to retire. And it was a great decision for me because I think my oldest son was 14. I spent probably a little less time with him than with the rest of them. My youngest son, he was 5 or 6 when I retired. And so I had a wonderful time being their Boy Scout leader and their baseball coach and attending all of their athletic activities right through high school. So for me, it was really a great experience. The other thing is, I said I went to work for U.S. Department of Homeland Security. My first year I was consulting, and my wife was upset with that because I was traveling probably 150, 200 days a year that first year. I finally was making some pretty good money compared to what NYPD was paying sergeants at the time. But my wife said I was not home enough still, that, being away a week at a time and not being there to help her with 4 children was a challenge. And so I thought about leaving the consulting business, but the company I was working with was really trying to build some programs more locally for law enforcement. And so we devised a plan to build a program in New York City that would be a partnership with the Department of Homeland Security, Center for Domestic Preparedness, and NYPD. And we started to develop these training programs where we came in and supported the police academy in giving training to police officers to respond to these weapons of mass destructions. They would be trained on how to dress out in the right personal protective equipment, how they can protect themselves, and how they can do some work in these fields of terrorism. So we taught them about, bombings and radiologicals and the chemical weapons. Interestingly, I was very fortunate because as we built this program, I'm able to hire police firefighters, people from crime scene, people from the bomb squad. Richard Teamsmith came to work for me.
Yep.
It was really just, we had great experience. And now we were taking these individuals and we were putting them back in front of police officers, back in front of the fire department. and they were training specific for these terrorist incidences. Again, that's why New York City was so well prepared. And in that partnership, we continued to help support the advanced training that was needed by these departments. So we would send the police officers in emergency service, in the rescue units, to the chemical weapons school in Alabama, to the Nevada test site, out to New Mexico Tech, so that we would have these people have the right level of training that they need in order to respond to those incidences. And so for me, and that expanded, because once we got that program running in New York, I then started to work at trying to develop that program in other states. Now, budgets and money became a problem with that. So we were still supporting doing some work in these other places, but nothing was as permanent as what was going on in New York. So I had a full-time staff plus consultants that were coming in that were supporting NYPD Police Academy personnel to do this COBRA training. They called it COBRA training. And I did that for about 7 years. We built a great program. And then I got called to give a presentation on terrorism and the incident command system. I had worked very closely trying to build the national incident management system with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and then worked with Phil Pulaski on building the NYPD's incident command program. And so Bank of America called me in to give them a little bit idea about this. Bank of America has 8 businesses, and they wanted to understand how they could manage 8 businesses being impacted. How do you manage that? And that is very similar to managing an incident in our real world with our emergency responders. Let's look at our resources and let's break it down into smaller parts and build a response capability. And they also wanted to understand the threat of terrorism. So I'm in the field. I gave them an hour presentation on the current threat picture for terrorism, gave them an hour presentation on the incident management system. And when I went to walk out, they wanted to offer me a job. And I said, I'm very happy in what I'm doing, supporting these police departments and response units around the world. The next day they called me back and they said, I don't think you understand. We're really interested in you, and we're going to make you an offer. They gave me a signing bonus. They made me an offer that was more higher salary than I was making with Homeland Security, and the potential for bonuses to come and help support the business continuity program at Bank of America. I'm here 15 years now. It was a great transition. There's a lot of things that we can do in the private sector in order to support business, so that we have business people now that hopefully we don't have to tax the first responders to help my employees in the bank, because we have a pretty good plan to help them stay out of harm's way.
Incredible. And that's something that I love about so many of you guys that retire out of the FDNY or NYPD. It doesn't stop. You just don't go home and take that knowledge and those stories with you. You so willingly, like we talked about the cops that taught you when you were coming on, you still willingly and so willingly share those stories with the rest of the field out there. Not just police officers or firefighters in New York City, but as you said, across the country, across the world. It's a lot to be proud of. It was very fulfilling for you in the NYPD, and it was definitely and still is very fulfilling for you in the private sector. And to see all you guys doing well, I mentioned Carl, I see William Dempsey, I see Carl Smith, Tommy Ridges, to see you guys carry all that from the police department to the private sector to you and to all of you guys that I just mentioned in the chat tuning in tonight. Bravo. Well done, guys. Keep it going. Even you, Steph, even though you're still on the NYPD, you teach when you're not in the ESU truck.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that about you, too.
I tell you, it's a great thing that there's people like Steve that is still in the unit. These people that have time on the job that really can show the new people what it's all about. That's what helped all of us on the job. The good cop is someone that helps that other person. The great cop is the person that continues to share that knowledge. And Steph is one of those great cops. I'm glad that he's still working. Thank you. And
you're quite welcome. So that brings us into the rapid fire. Time's flown by. It's almost been 2 hours, but it doesn't feel like it, honestly. This has been really, really enjoyable. It's 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. Are you ready?
Go for it, Mike.
First, besides the colleagues, which is, of course, the obvious answer, thing you miss most about the NYPD?
I will say, I have to watch the news. I'm in business continuity now with the bank. I have to understand everything that's going on really globally and how that might affect New York and the whole East. I cover the Northeast for Bank of America. And so I see this big job and, all of us want to be on that big job. And that's what you certainly miss the most, being able to get out there. As we talked here, Mike, first of all, it's a team effort. Emergency service is a great team. There was always a team effort to get any job accomplished. It was never any one person, but it was a group effort getting that job done. There was nothing better than working with those men and women in the emergency service unit to get out there and help that police officer and help that civilian.
Absolutely. Well said. Second, I know you were a volunteer fireman, so you can't say fire department. If not for the police department or the fire department, what other career could you have seen yourself pursuing and enjoying?
Well, it's interesting now. I work with a lot of building engineers in that area. And I said that I originally had gone to school to be an architect. I certainly enjoy the engineering side of that house. And that helped me. Having a little bit of training in the engineering field, when I became a member of the Urban Search and Rescue Task Force, that we had people that work with heavy equipment and worked understanding and engineering of a building and how it might have collapsed. So, that was a great lesson to me. I certainly would have enjoyed, I think, working in that field. Nowhere as near as much as being a police officer, for sure.
Of course. Backstage Pass, the greatest show on earth. And
Yes.
the NYPD is the show, as someone once told me. Third, favorite tool on the ESU truck, REP or big truck?
Everybody used to, joke around that I was always grabbing the first aid bag first. I always tried to think of the person first. And I certainly helped with the EMT program. I told you I was an instructor for years, and I became an instructor trainer. And so I would support NYPD. They had some great trainers there also. A guy that became my partner, Tom Rowe, ran the program for quite a number of years. And everyone before him, really just outstanding. But that was probably my favorite part of it, trying to get right to my hands on with the people. And so that first aid bag was invaluable in trying to help save that life.
Time out real quick on the rapid fire, because Tommy Rowe, who was featured in Cops, we got an overturn. Him and Glenn Klein, amongst others, making a rescue on an MVA. I called him a while ago. He was a sniper in ESU as well. Yeah. And unfortunately, I couldn't get him on the show. He declined. So I'm just saying, Tommy, you saw Tim on the show tonight. Come on the show, please. If you talk to Tom, let him know that.
Tom's one of the guys that I stay real close with. I'll reach out to Tom and see.
All right,
he's busy with life and his family. He's doing really well.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I know he had a full plate in his own right in emergency service. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City. You can say multiple. You don't have to say one.
Variety is a wonderful thing. And my wife is a wonderful lady. She's of Italian heritage. And I love the fact that her mother was such a great cook. My wife has developed into a wonderful cook. She's been a great partner. I love the fact that we like variety. And there's variety in my family. My sister married an African Haitian. He happens to be a great cook. My other brother married a Chinese woman. So we really have a smorgasbord of food also within the family. But when we go out, we really try to, look for a number of places of variety. We love going into the city still now. It's really for enjoyment. We try to go to plays. We try to go to the museums. It was something we always did with the kids, but it was always variety. So, go down to 8th Avenue and, try to get a little variety in our life. Certainly there's a few favorite places. I think Tony DiNapoli's is one that is close to Bank of America. And I will say when people come in, I normally walk them down the street and we'll sit at Tony D's and have a nice Italian feast.
There you go. You gotta get some Spanish food. As someone who's half Dominican, half Puerto Rican, you gotta cover that particular aspect too.
So my uncle married a Puerto Rican, and I have a lot of Spanish food in the family too. So
there you go.
Some more mix, Mike.
All right, some more mix. I love it. And the fifth and final question: knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you, as the current version of Tim Farrell, tell a younger Tim Farrell?
Get your college degree a little earlier. Maybe study a little bit more for that lieutenant's exam. I was on the list when I retired, but I was a little further down the path and just felt that it was still time for me to retire, not wait around for the next promotion. So, I told you I have 4 sons. I have one that really loves to work with his hands. My son Timothy, he's in a steam fitter union. He installs sprinklers. A person that's out there saving lives too in a different way.
Nice.
He was also a volunteer firefighter. My son Brian works in technology. He's currently working in Japan. He's been there a year. He'll be there for 1 more year.
Nice.
My next son is a Suffolk County police officer. So he's kind of followed in his father's footsteps a little bit. And then my youngest son is a captain in the United States Army stationed in Wiesbaden, Germany. So, get out there and experience the world.
Yep, there you go. And to your son, who's a Suffolk County cop, I'm just saying Suffolk has an ESU too. Maybe he wants to go the emergency route. You never know.
Well, he's very interested, and it's funny. My younger son, said they're good buddies, Andrew and Christopher, and said to Christopher, I could never be a Suffolk County cop. He says, if I'm gonna go into the police department, I'm gonna go into ESU. He's a captain in the Army, and he's in a field artillery unit, but wants to be a ranger. He's got his ranger tab. He's actually competed in the best ranger competition. He did very well in the best ranger competition. He's hoping that maybe one day he'll have a chance to go to the ranger division also, the ranger battalion. But
Nice.
we'll see. Yeah.
You've done well, and you've raised a great family too. This was so enjoyable. Stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. I thank you so much for your time.
Let me just give one more statement, Mike, if I
Sure.
can. Chief Adamone was really a pleasure to work for and with. I have great respect for the man. Did a lot of great work for the bombing in 1993 and more work as life went on. But he sent a letter out to everyone, and I still keep the letter, and I think that this is a great way to salute the police officers. And this is a quote from Lou Adamone. I salute you all for your dedication to duty and unflinching response to a life-threatening emergency. Again, many thanks, and for a job well done. I send that out to police officers, firefighters, anyone that might be listening here that's a first responder. Continue to get great training. Continue to be dedicated to your craft. Do the best that you can. Pay attention. Keep your eyes in the back of your head so you know what's going on all around you. Be safe and enjoy your job.
Thank you so much again. Round of applause. Well done, my friend. Stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. Lou Adamone's another friend of mine. He's been on the show twice, and I just had lunch with him here in Connecticut the other day. Really, really a wonderful man who still, all these years later, loves the police department. He left it in name only. He's still very much involved.
Yes.
And he was a pleasure he's a pleasure to have as a friend. I can only imagine how much of a pleasure he must have been to work for and have as a boss. Coming up next in the Mike the New podcast, we're starting a new mini-series this Tuesday. I'm introducing The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. I want to start profiling more police officers and firefighters from around the country. So as someone like myself who grew up watching Cops, not just the current episodes, but the reruns too, for those of you that may remember the Cleveland, Ohio episodes in the 90s, he's the one that shouted, "Get on it, Mel," and what is arguably the greatest pursuit in the history of the show. His name is Gary Mullins, and he'll be here this Tuesday for Volume 1, the debut of The Beat. Profiles of police nationwide. In the meantime, on behalf of retired Emergency Service Unit Sergeant Tim Farrell, I'm Mike Colón. We will see you next time. Have a great weekend. And as the E-men like to say, anytime, baby. Take care and enjoy the rest of your night.